Today, we're jumping into something really fascinating: qualitative research methods. This is all about the science of understanding human experience. I mean, think about it for a second. How do you actually research a feeling, or an experience, or an entire culture? They're really big questions, right? They're not always about numbers. They're about the messy, complex stories that make us who we are. So, how do you tackle that? Well, that's what we're going to dig into. So here's how we're going to break it down today. Think of it like a researcher's journey. First, we'll look at what it means to go beyond the numbers. Then, we'll peek inside the researcher's toolkit. After that, we'll see how they get from chaos to clarity with all that data. And finally, we'll tackle a super important question: how do they earn our trust? All right, let's get right into it. Section 1: Beyond the Numbers. This is all about moving past just counting things and really getting to the heart of the why behind the what. So, what's the big idea here? At its core, qualitative research isn't about some researcher sitting in an office dreaming up a theory to test. No, it's really about humility. It's about stepping into someone else's world to understand their reality from their point of view. The researcher's main job? It's simply to listen and to learn. And these are the things that really make this approach so unique. I mean, first off, the research happens in a natural setting. You go where the action is. And get this, the researcher is the key instrument. They're the ones using their own eyes and ears to gather information. And they're not just using one method, like a survey. They're pulling from everything: interviews, documents, you name it, all to build this really complex, holistic picture of what's going on. Okay, so that leads us perfectly into our next section. If you're going to build that rich, complex picture, what tools do you actually have in your toolkit? What does this look like when the rubber meets the road? Okay, whoa, that's a lot of text, right? Don't worry about memorizing this whole chart. The main point is to show you the four big ways researchers gather these stories: observations, interviews, documents, and even audio or video. And the key thing to remember is that no single method is perfect. They each have their pros and cons, their strengths and weaknesses. So let's zoom in on a classic example of these trade-offs: observation versus interviews. When you're observing, you get to see things as they naturally happen. It's firsthand experience. But the big limitation is that just by being there, you might actually make people act differently. On the other hand, with an interview, you can tap into someone's whole life story, their history. The catch? You're getting it all through their filter, their memories, their opinions. So you see, there's no best way. It's always about picking the right tool for the job. Okay, so you've done it. You've collected hours of interviews. You've got notebooks full of observations. You're basically sitting on a mountain of data. Now what? Well, that brings us to section 3. This is where the magic happens. It's about turning all that chaos into clarity. Now, this diagram here might look kind of complicated, but it's basically a roadmap. You start at the bottom with all your messy, raw data. Interview transcripts, notes, all that stuff. And then you just work your way up, step by step. You organize, you read, you find patterns, until bam, you get to a clear interpretation at the top. So let's break down the core of that process. Step 1 is just logistics. Get all your data organized and ready to go. Step 2, you just read through everything, seriously, just to get a feel for what you have. Then comes step 3, and this is a big one. You code the data. And finally, you take all those codes and start grouping them into bigger themes. These themes, that's what ends up being the core of your findings. And I love this quote because it makes coding sound way less intimidating than it is. Just imagine you're reading an interview. Someone says something that makes you think, they sound pretty isolated. So you highlight it. And in the margin, you just jot down the word isolation. That's it. That's a code. You just do that over and over again, and pretty soon you start to see patterns emerge. It's how you organize the chaos. All right, we're on to our final and maybe most important section. I mean, you might be thinking, with no numbers, no statistics, how do we actually know any of this is accurate? How do we trust the findings? How do we know the researcher didn't just see what they wanted to see? And that's a great question. The key here is a subtle but really important shift in thinking. In the world of numbers, you talk about reliability, but here the goal is validity. And validity is really just a fancy word for making sure the findings are accurate, credible, and trustworthy. And researchers have a whole bunch of strategies to make sure their work is valid. For example, there's something called triangulation. Think of it like a detective who talks to multiple witnesses to piece together the real story. Or number checking. That's literally when the researcher goes back to the people they interviewed and asks, "Hey, did I get your story right?" All these strategies you see here, they're all about one thing: making sure the final conclusions are honest and grounded in reality. So there you have it. That's the journey of qualitative research, how we go beyond just the numbers to really capture human experience. And honestly, in a world that's obsessed with big data, understanding the why is more important than ever. The why behind a customer's choice, or a patient's story, or an employee's motivation. It's a powerful reminder that while numbers are great for telling us what is happening, it's the stories that truly tell us why. So the only question left is, what story will you look for?